Good morning. We'll be starting up here in a little over a minute. You're going to want to go ahead and open up your chat pod and your Q&A pod and get ready to do the polls. polev.com/DavidOrP. Or you can download the app if you prefer. Don't care which way. You do not need to sign in, though. You don't need an account. Just if it asks you to do anything, try skipping. We just need to have you in there. But if you can't access the polls, we can make it work. We'll see how many folks sign up, or excuse me, show up out of the signups. We should do a betting pool on this next time, Amanda. Okay, we'll give folks about 30 seconds to log in, and then we will go ahead and get started because we've hit the top of the hour. Okay, numbers have stopped growing, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the Corner Local Roads program. We're your New York State LTAP Center, and welcome to the third in our series that's dealing with road safety, specifically some roadway departure stuff. We'll talk about that. And today we're going to be talking about proven countermeasures. Okay. Now, if you haven't been on one of these before, down in the lower left, you can check your audio and stuff like that. You're going to want to open up your chat pod and your Q&A pods. The chat pod is just one way. That's where we send you information. We will be sending out the links and the handouts. If you had already logged in, you may have seen it. In a minute, Amanda, who's in the background, will hit a button and do it again. Other helper today is Nick, because Jody, who's normally on here, is helping us get set up for our advisory panel meeting, which starts as soon as this is done. So it's a busy day. So a lot of the materials that we're going to be talking about today come from several sources, which are included in the handout. One is the Federal Highway Administration's Proven Safety Countermeasures website, and there's some really good stuff today. In fact, a lot of what we're talking about today comes from there. There's the New York State Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and we have been over the last couple of weeks. And then our book on Solution for Safer Roads and Streets, and I see Jim Markles on here. He actually wrote the version of this last time, and we've kept a lot of that material, Jim, so you should feel good about that. It's still in there for Solutions for Safer Roads and Streets. And by the way, that workshop will be held in 2025, so watch this space. So this, again, as I said, is the third of four, I can't count, third of four webinars dealing with road safety. We did combating roadway departures. Why is this an issue? Last week we talked about local road safety plans. Today, proven countermeasures. And the next week we're going to focus on improvements of curbs because that's such a major and important area. Almost half of the fatalities that occur due to roadway departures occur near or because of curb issues. So we'll start with our normal welcome that we do for these webinars. And again, this is where you're going to want to do the polls. So it's www.polev.com/DavidOrPE. If you can't access the poll, if it's being a pain, you can put that into uh, the Q&A. So you can open up the Q&A. That's just fine. So let's do a little bit of polling here to see who you are. That helps me. I have a feeling I know, but I never assume. It's never a good idea. So who do you work for? Do you work for a town, a county, a city or village, state or federal, tribal? I did add MPO, so if you're with an MPO, you can put that in there. Are you working for a consulting firm, a contractor? And we have a couple of people who are honest and they work for the weekend. Okay. And again, if you can't access the poll, you can put it in the Q&A. So I have someone who put in that they're from a city or village. Okay. That's a pretty good group. I like that. That's good to see. A good variety of folks. Okay. And then what is your job? I'm going to make a bet in terms of your job, but let's just see what we've got. What is your job? Are you an engineer? Are you the highway superintendent or the deputy? Are you a planner, administrator, field crew, board member? None of the above. So we have a road crew foreman. We have another supervisor. Cool. Okay. And finally, where are you from around the state? Um, we'll just see. When we did our Basics of a Good Road webinar on Tuesday, we actually had some people from outside the state, but let's see what we have today. Okay, actually, I like that. That's good. We got all over the state. We have the North Country, we have Long Island, we have way out in Jamestown. Ah, we have somebody who's either in Ontario or on a boat out in Lake Erie. That's good. Okay, that's cool. I didn't know you could get Wi-Fi out there. Okay. That helps me quite a bit. I know what my focus is going to be. We got a lot of engineers, but we also have quite a few folks who work in the field. So that's actually going to help me as we talk about things. Now, again, just as a reminder, because we wanted to make sure each of these webinars can stand on its own, why are we doing this series? Well, it's because we've had a huge increase in fatalities. During COVID, we got some bad habits and our fatality numbers went way up. Before COVID, we were getting close to 30,000 per year nationwide. They're over 40,000 annually right now, and we really need to get back to those earlier numbers. Even better yet, we could get down towards zero, especially for fatalities and serious injuries, because those are life-changing in not a good way. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about roadway departures, but FHWA has several crash focus areas. Roadway departures is one of them, because again, a high percentage of fatalities occur due to roadway departures, leaving your lane, rolling over, having a side swipe or a head-on, things like that. But there are also focus areas of intersections and bicycles and pedestrians, and these are things we'll talk about with proven countermeasures as well. So we'll go from that standpoint. And then a lot of the things we're talking about come from the New York State Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. If you want, it's a link in the handout. And again, Amanda has posted that a couple of times in the chat pod. So open that chat pod up so you can access this. Make sure you download both the action plan and the appendices. There's a lot of really good information in those appendices if we looked at things like that. Now, somebody over in the Q&A raised a question. I'll go back to the map and show you. The question is, what would the map look like if it was per road mile or per capita? Well, if it's per road mile, um, yes, it would be concentrated in more urban areas. But if you look at it, crash rates per vehicle miles driven, it's actually higher in rural areas. Rural areas actually have a higher crash rate per vehicle mile driven. There's less vehicles, but there's actually more serious and fatal crashes for a variety of reasons. There's not a single reason. There's no single magic bullet to solve all of our problems. Now, when it comes to roadway departures, we've talked about this a couple of times, but the idea is we want to keep the vehicle on the road, keep them in their lane by using things like good delineation and stripes and even rumble strips. We want to reduce the potential for the crash if they leave the lane by using countermeasures such as safety edges and good clear zones, and we'll talk about these today. And finally, if they do have a crash, and hit something, we'd like to minimize the severity by protecting them or using breakaway hardware. And again, it will depend upon the situation, what we're going to be looking at. Now, FHWA has a whole bunch of proven countermeasures, total of 28 of them. They focus them in several different areas. They've got speed management issues, such as variable speed limits and speed cameras. We won't be talking about them much today just because we only have an hour together. They also have a whole series of things aimed at that bicycle and pedestrian, those vulnerable road users. We will talk a little bit about those if we have time, but there's a whole bunch of cool ideas there, such as better improvements for crosswalks and walkways. Roadway departures, again, that's one of our primary focus areas. There's 6 proven countermeasures there. Intersections, there's 7. We'll talk about a couple of those as well, because we don't want to forget those focus areas when it comes to proven countermeasures. And there are even some cross-cutting things. One of the things I would tell you, we can't cover them all, but when you go later on, go on the web and go to the FHWA's Proven Countermeasures website, look under resources, or you can individually look at all of the different countermeasures. Download the book and start looking. There's some pretty cool stuff in the booklet. Every one of them comes with a description, talks about the applications, the when, the where, the why. A lot of them have crash modification factors in them. These are essentially what percentage crash reductions do you get for certain types of crashes. We'll talk about a few of those. And then the benefit cost ratio. And not every single case is there a great benefit cost ratio, but there's enough information to tell you whether it's going to be a low cost, medium cost, or high cost. And you can see even here where there's text you can't read. I don't want you to try to read it. You can even see them some percentages there. Those are percent reductions in crashing. Okay, so there's some safety value in all of these, and they've been proven. Now, New York State in their Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan put in a matrix to help you select the right countermeasure. Again, they're focused on roadway departures. And there's a whole bunch that are primary uh, countermeasures, such as markings for fixed objects and curves and even straightaways. There's others that are proven but aren't the primary thing, such as looking at friction values on the roadway or looking at the clear zone. But again, this is for the state system. You may think a little bit differently, but that's part of developing your local road safety plan, which we talked about last week. Now, which proven countermeasures should we focus on? Because we can't cover them all today. Well, that's a chicken and egg kind of thing. So what I did is I went through all of them and I said, well, which one do I really want to select? Which ones are we going to focus on? Well, I want to focus on those that are relatively low cost or have the biggest bang for the buck. Really high benefit cost ratios are really large reduction in the number of crashes that occur. We won't be able to cover them all, but we've already talked about a few, and some we'll focus on next week with curves. For instance, last week's webinar was on local road safety plans. And by the way, there is a recording. If you'd like, you can go back and see the recording, though I never like to see my own recordings, to be totally, completely honest with you. But this is a proven safety countermeasure where we focus on developing plans. We're systematic or systemic risk-based, and we focus on fixing crashes, hopefully before they occur. And by getting everybody on board, we get a lot of benefit. We could be doing road safety audits. We briefly touched on this last week as well, and that means you bring lots of different voices in to look at problems, not just the engineers, not just the public safety people, but businesses, schools, homeowners, and you can look at problems and get different viewpoints, and that actually tends to help get a better solution. We could talk about some cross-cutting things like high friction surface treatments. They're pretty cool, but here in New York State, we actually have a pretty good program, but there are places in the state, like out on Long Island, where we had somebody, where they've used something called high friction surface treatment. And you can see here how much faster a vehicle can stop when it's on a high friction surface. Again, there's lots and lots of really cool, really good countermeasures out there, things you may want to think about looking at for your own community. Okay? So what we're going to do, we're going to focus on about 8 areas. We'll touch on about 15 or so of the proven countermeasures. The ones that are in the handout that are underlined, because I've listed all of the FHWA's proven safety countermeasures. We're going to talk about as many of those as we can in our hour together, but we'll let you out of here right at the top of the hour. Plus, we all need to get downstairs to our advisory panel meeting. So in terms of these proven solutions, which of those have you used? Have you used curve delineation for a specific problem? Do you have an improved clear zone policy? Have you done pavement marking, safety edge, rumble strips, crosswalk improvements, roundabouts or better signals and crossings? Let's see which ones of those you have done. Okay, so out of the about 55 of you, about half or so have done pavement markings. Quite a few have done curve delineation. Some are looking at improved clear zone. That's good. Crosswalk improvements. Okay, better signals. Okay, good. It's good to know. Now, some of you have listed some that safety edge and rumble strips. I'm glad to see that. And somebody asked in the Q&A, and again, please ask as we go along, are these countermeasures also for urban streets? Absolutely. Okay. While the focus is on roadway departures, the proven countermeasures are for all roads and streets. And in that booklet, they'll actually talk about whether they're more valuable in urban areas, rural areas, intersections, roadway departures, vulnerable road users like bicycles and pedestrians. So there's really good information. These are proven for all different types of roads. So yes, you're probably not going to be seeing signal improvements in a rural area, much in the same way you don't typically see, well, actually you do sometimes see roundabouts in urban areas. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Now, again, next week's webinar is on improvements at curves. So we're not going to do a lot with delineation and horizontal curves, but we know that is an incredibly valuable thing to do. It really has a very high benefit to make sure we delineate curves, especially high-speed curves, okay? And so this is something we'll be talking a lot more about next week, but I did just want to remind you there is a new National Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD, that's out. It has a December date on the cover. It was officially released on January of this year. New York State is currently working on their supplement to it, but it is the rule here in New York State. So if there's a conflict, you follow the national. But if you're not sure, contact the state DOT in your region, contact us. There's lots of resources to make sure we get our signage done properly. And so there is a new MUTCD out there. Now, as part of that, there's some new rules and requirements for delineation around corners. And so just keep that in mind, and we'll talk a lot more about that next week. Somebody did ask, when is the supplement expected to be released? The way New York State wrote the law that has the supplement, they have 18 months to get that done. So if you do 18 months from January, you can see that it could be a while. Okay, so it'd be probably January. Actually, no, it's 2 years. Never mind, it's 2 years. It'll be January of 2026 when they have to have it done by. But they're hopeful to have something out in later 2025. For most local roads, county roads, town roads, village streets, the changes aren't that dramatic except around curves, which we'll talk about next week, because those changes really are something we should be implementing now as part of proven safety countermeasures. Okay? Um, and so the reason that they have a supplement, somebody asked in the Q&A why New York State has a supplement, partly because there are uh, some things New York State wants to do slightly different. They've got slightly different spacing, for instance, for where they place the signs. Um, will that stay forever? Maybe, maybe not. There are some signs New York State has that are not in the national. The supplement has gotten thinner. The first supplement 2 cycles ago was over 400 pages. The last one is a couple of hundred. I suspect this one will probably be a little bit less. If you're wondering, by the way, nationwide, about half the states use the national directly, though a few of them do have a few specific. They don't call them a supplement, but they do have a few specific. The rest have a supplement of different types. Um, if you're curious, we can talk about that. Now, in terms of delineation on the road, how many of you know how to use a ball bank? You can give me a poll. We don't get to see the votes live this time. You can say yes, no, or what is a ball bank? Yes, no, what is a ball bank? Okay, let's go down here and look at the results, see what people have. We have a few yeses, we have a few nos, we have what is a ball bank, and interestingly enough, in the Q&A, we have one of each, the people who couldn't access the polls. Okay. A ball bank indicator essentially is the slope meter that sits on a grader, but it's got special little notches, and when you go around the corner, that little black ball that's inside a fluid goes and swings out, and it tells you, are you going too fast around the corner? We'll talk quite a bit about that next week and why that device, the Riker device, or other techniques for improving safety around corners is so important. We're also going to be talking about roadside design improvements at curves, another proven countermeasure from the Federal Highway Administration, and is certainly listed. But I do want to spend a little bit of time here, not on the curve portion of it, but this is actually where, within the proven countermeasures, they talk about improving the clear zone, removing fixed objects. That's specifically called out in the New York State Department Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, but it is something we need to be thinking about. So let's talk a little bit about clear zones and why that is so important. Oh, before I forget, somebody asked, is the ball bank still the best method for checking the curves? It's a method. Come next week and I'll talk about the disadvantages and advantages of it. I'm a huge fan of the ball bank or other measuring devices, and I'll talk about why next week. So sorry, just limited time, but I do like the ball bank or equivalent kind of devices. In terms of clear zone, you may have seen this before. If you have, you probably already know the answer to this. But if your tire blew out on this roadway and you had to pull off the road in an emergency, would you pull off to the left or right? How many of you would pull off to the left? Raise your hand. You get to raise your hand this time. Go down to lower left and raise your hand. We got to see how many people raise their hands. A few would go to the left, okay? Okay, I'm going to lower everybody's hands. Now, how many of you would go to the right? How many would go to the right? Quite a few of you would go to the right. Because, hey, there's just some grass over there, right? It looks good. Ah, somebody's caught it already in the Q&A. I'm going to lower everybody's hands. Um, if you take this and blow up the picture, this was taken by Jeff Scott. I was driving down a road, and look what they didn't do. They didn't remove the stumps. In some respects, it's actually almost more dangerous with the stumps than if the tree was still there, because that's a fixed object. That is going to be very, very dangerous. Yes, there's a bit of a shoulder, but is it enough? If you have trees removed, cut them flush. Anything above about 4 inches can snag a vehicle. And we know that trees are the most deadly in terms of fatal crashes due to hitting a fixed object. Almost half of fatalities where you run off the road occur because you've hit a tree. And people go, oh, well, that's a rural problem. Surprisingly, um, about a third of tree fatalities occur inside urban areas, and it's actually about a 50-50 split. Not exactly, but pretty close for high speed versus low speed. Hitting trees is not a good thing, so we really want to try to take care and get rid of our trees. But we also want a clear zone consistency. A narrow clear zone that's consistent is actually going to be safer than one that goes in and goes out. Because if a vehicle goes off, and we already talked last week about how that's a bit of a random effect, now you may actually lead them into a problem. They're like, they hit that shoulder and they're like, I'll be okay. I'll just slow down and stop. But now you've got something that they hit rather than just being able to slow down and stop the vehicle. You want to have clear zone consistency. You want to make sure you put breakaway hardware, especially in high speed, but even in low speed, it can make a bit of a difference. So here's an example of just a single post, the small pipe, and an old Honda Civic. And it was a bad day. Good thing there was nobody actually in this as a crash test. But we want to make sure we're using proper breakaway hardware. And by the way, utility poles, if they're done right, will actually handle a crash. I don't know if you saw on the news the video in Syracuse where a truck actually took out the bottom of a utility pole and the rest of it just hung in the air. It did actually what it was supposed to do. But we need to think about breakaway hardware to improve safety, what we can do. So let me ask you this. It's not that long ago, but we're doing these as we go along for our PDH stuff. What's the most deadly fixed object? Can the link to the handout be sent again? Watch this amazingly. If you have the chat pod, give you about 10 seconds, open your chat pod up, and we will pop that back into the chat pod for you for the handouts. And yes, trees. Very good. Yep. Now, let's talk a little bit about pavement markings. The specific proven countermeasure I'll come to in a second, but lines are extremely valuable. We know they help. There's huge advantages to having them. The visual value of lines, even on a straightaway, is pretty clear. Even just a center line can help people keep people on the roadway. Even an old edge line that needs to be redone because it's been the end of winter and we haven't got the leaves back out yet can be of real value. And of course, when are they most valuable? They're most valuable at night, but they're still valuable even during the day. And actually, to me, this time of day, the twilight, that's a time I have a harder time driving now. Driving at night's actually not as bad as that twilight period. My eyesight, I need more light. I'm getting a little older. So you want to think about putting down good edge lines. It's really, really important to have good edge lines. Okay? Now, just going to ask you to raise your hand. Let's see how everybody does here. Does your agency have a policy for how often you replace your stripes that you've already got? Raise your hand if you already have a policy for the stripes you've already got. Okay, well, that's good. Good to see. It is a requirement in the MUTCD to have a plan to maintain the retroreflectivity or the brightness of your lines. You just have to have a good plan in place. There are accommodations for the fact that there is issues related to snow ice control. Okay. And then the question, of course, comes is how often is good enough? I see some people putting in 3-year cycles. Some people say they have no striping at all. Yeah. Again, there's lots of different choices out there. And by the way, from the last thing about breakaway, what's the best breakaway treatment for signpost? Depends on the kind of post. There's all kinds of different hardware that's out there. Match the hardware, breakaway hardware, to the post type that you're typically using. There's plenty of good choices out there. There's a website the state and the feds keep up that lists the hardware that's been approved. There's safety letters that go with it. There are new crash testing standards, so not everything's been reapproved. But again, there's lots of different choices. Pick one that works for your agency. Okay. Now, the actual proven countermeasure is wider edge lines. So going from 4-inch to 6-inch. It is not a requirement in the new MUTCD. There was a big debate about that. The standard was 4 inches, and they could have gone to 6. It was decided to leave it at 4 inches as the minimum standard. But this is something that I'm always reminded of. The MUTCD, the AASHTO Pavement Design Guide, the New York State specifications, those are all standards. And rather than saying, let's meet the standard, why don't we go, that's the minimum. Why don't we do better where we need to do better? So start thinking about, are there places where you could put in a 6-inch line that might be a better choice? Do you have a place where you have evidence that people tend to run off the road a little bit, or sometimes have a hard time at night? Or maybe in an urban area where there's more ambient light, you actually want to think about putting in that wider line. We know that going from a 4-inch to a 6-inch has a crash modification factor of a 0.78, i.e. a 22% reduction on average in the number of serious and fatal crashes. That's really a good idea, okay? So this is something you may want to think about, and you can see that the line is pretty clearly a little bit brighter. This is just down the road, So think about putting in the wider line. If you have a policy. Where should you put stripes on your roadway? Well, again, once you start putting them, you do need to maintain them, but they're extremely valuable. And next week, when we talk about curves, there are some times now they are actually going to be required, that or some other form of delineation. So let me ask you this. Do you remember what I just said about 6-inch pavement markings? Are they required in the new MUTCD? Yes, no, or you don't remember what I just said? Let's see what y'all think. And I'll go pop your responses open. Yeah, they're not required. But it is still a good idea to think about as part of your policy. Maybe there's places we could put them in. And you could do like Minnesota did and try them out in a few spots, see if they work for you, and then start becoming more systematic over your entire system over time. Okay? Now I'm going to bring up a proven countermeasure that I know a lot of you probably go, ooh, and that is rumble strips. Okay? So raise your hand if your agency has rumble strips, centerline or shoulder, sometimes called cards and shards. So a few of you do, probably the state people, because we know the state roads have them. We don't see them much on the local system, and there are big debates about what percentage should have shoulder and centerline rumble strips. If you're wondering, by the way, a shard stands for Shoulder Audible Roadway Delineator. Okay? i.e., it's a form of delineation. There needs to be a gap put in on a regular basis to help bicyclists, but shoulder rumbles have their place. Okay? They do help reduce the number of serious and fatals, and surprisingly, one of the places they can really help a lot is in more urban areas where there's distractions, okay? But it's something to think about. Now, when you start looking at this, you can realize that we know there's some things people worry about them, okay? But I would put this in your bag of things to put down in a few limited spots. Try it out. And there are some complaints. So let's talk about that a little bit. We've got some time. Let's talk about some possible things you could do. Now, typical rumble dimensions. I want to just right now apologize. The terminology that is used talks about the length of the rumble strip. The length of the rumble strip, they say the shoulder rumble length is 12 to 16 inches. They're not talking down the road. They're talking what you and I would call the width of the rumble. The reason they do this, by the way, is how they're installed. They're installed with a milling machine, essentially. And so they're talking about how much they have to mill. And so that's the length of the milling. But it's really what you and I would call the length. So just be aware of that fact, just something to be aware of. And can you use these rumble strips in urban areas? Absolutely. They actually have their place in urban areas. And yet people worry about the noise. Let's talk about that noise a little bit. Now, in terms of edge lines, you can actually go slightly narrower if you just don't have as much space. 8 to 12 inches can be done in some cases. Okay? When you don't have a shoulder behind it, but you still want to rumble, drop it down a little bit. You still have width. Heck, people have put down as little as 6 to 4 inches. You don't hit it as soon, but you can fit it into a really narrow spot. Okay? They also make versions of rumble strips that instead of being grooved like you see here in the photograph, they look like a sinusoidal shape. They're called mumble strips, and they're about 50%, and again, we'll debate the actual amount. They're quieter. And so in a residential area where you're trying to balance the noise of the rumble versus the noise of a crash, trust me, I'd rather hear a rumble than a crash, um, you might try thinking about maybe we'll put in some mumble strips or some other form of delineation, edge striping, roadside delineators, things like that. Why are people leaving the roadway? Because you do want to think about the human factors as well. And the centerline rumble strips is something we may want to think about. And when we talk about curves, there's some other things we might think about doing as well. Here's a trick for you. It's actually a pretty good one. Use something called a rumble stripe with the E purposely larger because it enhances the visibility. This is a Michigan initiative, and others had done it as well, where they actually put in the rumble, and then they purposely put the edge line right on top of the rumble, sometimes centered, like you see in the picture, sometimes off to the left side, like you saw in one of the earlier pictures. The advantage of this particular thing is it doesn't get worn down by snowplows and vehicles as much, and that vertical face, when you spray it, stays retroreflective for quite a while. So it's actually pretty good. Um, and yes, you can mix, as someone said in the Q&A, you can mix rumble strips with reflectors and cat's eyes in the middle of the road. You have to think about snowplow operations if you want to do that. One of the reasons we like rumbles is the cost is relatively low. Um, and then people talk about the maintenance of these things where they rumble strips, they get potholes, and they fill them back in. We'll talk about that in just a second, I promise you. In terms of centerline rumble strips, what is the value? Well, the crash modification factors for rural two-lane roads in a certain range of traffic where the research was done, as you can see, reduces crashes by about 20%. Okay? And it's especially valuable for opposite direction, i.e. head-on or sideswipe crashes. Okay? So good rule of thumb, it's about 20%. I also want to point out something to you. If you go to the crash modification clearinghouse, the CMF clearinghouse, which is online, has all kinds of great stuff on it, make sure you choose the ones that have good quality data. They've either got 4 or 5 stars or they report the standard error. The standard error can tell you a lot about how good the results are. I've seen crash modification factors that looks great, but the standard error was larger than the crash modification factor, which is a way of saying we really don't know what's going to happen. It's very site specific. These are very tight, very small errors. We know there's going to be some improvement. We just don't know exactly how much. Now, in terms of the maintenance of these things, yes, it can make a difference, the quality of the roadway you're putting the rumble on. So you may need to think about that. But you can put these on chip seals, not on just a single chip seal, obviously, but if you have enough thickness to put in the rumble, it can work. What the state of Washington has done, and this is actually not a bad idea, is if they're worried about the damage that the rumble installation does in terms of breaking the surface of the asphalt, they come back along and they put a chip seal or a sand seal or even a fog seal right over the rumble to reseal that surface and protect it. And they've had good results where the rumbles last longer on roadways that otherwise might have had some pothole or water problems. So that's something you may want to think about adding into your mix if you're going along. Okay? So rumbles have their place. So Rumble strips reduce injury and fatal crashes in rural areas by approximately how much? What do you think? What do you remember? And I'll go pop on the responses so we can go look and see what y'all say. Yeah, 20%. It might be 10, it might be 30. Um, Again, every site will be slightly different, but a good rule of thumb, it's about a 20% reduction. And it's a little bit more for opposing crashes. So if you've got a site where there's evidence people are cutting across the line, you might want to think about it, even in an area where there's some residences nearby. But maybe there you think about a slightly narrower one or a mumble strip. There are other techniques out there as well, but it's something, again, you might want to have in your bag of tricks. Now we're going to come across one I wish everybody had. To me, this is the one that we should all do systematically, not a systemic, not a risk-based approach. I'd like to see this particular proven countermeasure everywhere. And that's called the safety edge. Now we've all seen this where a road gets paved and there's this drop-off. And that is a very dangerous thing. So watch this test vehicle trying to come back up when they drop off. They purposely are doing this to show you. You've all seen this, or maybe even experienced it yourself. Vehicle is going to come down the road and it's going to try to pull back up off that drop off. And as you pull harder and harder, now when you come back into the road, you can lose control, swing into the other lane. That leads to head-ons, leads to possible fatalities, or even rollovers. So we know that that really can create some issues because it's hard for that vehicle to get back up off a drop-off like this. Okay, even a few inches can make a huge difference. So what they found was, well, if we put the pavement in with a wedge, okay, that wedge at a 30 to 35-degree angle makes a huge difference in terms of the ability to pull back up onto the roadway. And by the way, it actually has a double benefit. Not only does it make it safer for the vehicle, because when they go off, they can actually get control and get back into the lane safely. It improves the edge compaction durability because this wedge is put inside the paver and the vibration from the paver as part of the wedge holds it a lot better than trying to roll it in place. And in terms of how much does that improve things? Well, look at this video. This is the day after they paved. You can see there's a lot of trucks. They're driving on pretty much fresh asphalt. And you'll see as they go by, there's almost no damage. The safety edge has actually protected the project. Okay? There's no physical deterioration. It's holding up. And so you get the benefit of increased durability and the benefit of improved safety. It's a double win. Now, this does not mean you can just pave the road and walk away. You still need to come back and put in your shoulders. And people go, well, that's going to be hard to get it compacted. Chemung County has been doing safety edge for quite a while. They've had no evidence that putting in shoulders is a problem. Backing them up, the shoulders hold up just fine. You still need to come back in there. Are the safety edges compacted during construction? Well, of course they are. They're compacted. Actually, the majority of the compaction is in the paver as it comes out with the vibration if it's set right. And then the rollers do actually a little bit more, and that angle helps it compact itself. So yes, they've held up. If we had 30 minutes to talk about safety edge or 20 minutes, we could get into the fact that there's good evidence that even 5, 10 years later, those edges are holding up just fine versus edge cracking that you see when people don't back those shoulders up. And the thing that's nice about this, someone mentioned, what happens if I don't have the right of way? It's one of the reasons I like this particular technique. You can use pretty much the existing prism that you've already got. You're not widening the road, you're just putting an edge on the. So think about where your shoulder is going to go, even if it's a narrow shoulder. Just stay within your existing prism, put in the edge, and then put the shoulder to the right of way you already have. It's one you can fit in a pretty tight spot. Okay? So now, when we have this, let's just ask the question, give me two benefits that come with a safety edge. Pick two, and I'll see how you guys do. Pick two. Can you improve the pavement durability? Allows the agency to not have to back up the shoulders, improves the safety for vehicles leaving the traveled way, or requires less asphalt. And we have this, I think we're going to be pretty consistent. Let's just say, yeah. It improves safety, it improves durability. You still need to back up the shoulders. It doesn't use less asphalt, but actually, surprisingly, it doesn't use that much more. We're talking very small amount of extra. That's that little bitty wedge, and it does a lot of good value for you. I do know, as I say, a couple of counties, Washington and Chemung, who actually have it in the standards. The state has it in the standards. You should be using it. And it's something I'd like to see all of us adopt because it has a tremendous benefit, a very high crash modification factor, especially for rollover crashes and vehicles coming back up. Okay. Now let's go with another proven countermeasure that I know is going to be controversial, that a lot of people love, a lot of people hate, and that's the infamous roundabout. Okay. How many of you have roundabouts? Raise your hand if you have roundabouts. Oh, I had a feeling. Oh, we got a few of you. That's good. Oh, cool. Okay, that's actually good to see. So almost 20 of you, 17 of you had roundabouts. That's pretty good. Why do we like roundabouts? Well, they eliminate the need for a traffic light in some cases, and they're really good at reducing conflict points. At a four-way intersection, okay, we have in just a two-lane, four-lane intersection, we have 32 vehicle conflict points, and if there are pedestrians in the area, 24 pedestrian conflicts, and some of them are the worst. They're the head-on or T-boning type of crashes. Those are some of the most dangerous crashes that we can have, and pedestrians can be high speed. If we go to a roundabout, we've now taken what was a whole lot of conflict points and brought it down to 8 for the vehicles and 8 for pedestrians. Now, I will say, if you're designing a roundabout and you've got pedestrians, you have to include them in the design. Because if you don't, you may have a high speed coming out of the roundabout issue. So make sure you include them in the design in the first place. But the cool thing for the pedestrians is they only, if you do it right, only have to cross one direction of traffic, cross one lane, or there's some rare two-lane crossings, but one lane and they're good. They can be used in rural areas, they can be used in urban areas, but think about the pedestrians and, of course, by the way, think about snow plowing. I know we haven't seen much evidence of snow yet, but do think about how you're going to snow plow it, but they can be very valuable. Now, here is a high volume roundabout in Michigan, okay? And this is one of the reasons people say, oh, I don't like roundabouts, because you can see there's a lot of traffic. It's the morning commute, and vehicles are, they're having a little bit of a hard time finding a gap. Yes, they might have to wait, but if you watch this video, you'll actually see, sure, the person who comes in next, they have a hard time finding a gap, and it takes them about 20 or 30 seconds to get there. But think about a traffic light. If you get caught by a traffic light, it might be a minute or two. It turns out they're actually pretty good for volume. Are there limitations? Well, of course there are limitations. That's true with any tool. But if you design them the right way, they're good for all users. As somebody put into the Q&A, they're good for pike and ped users. And some people don't think they are. I think the reason for that is, A, there are still people who don't know about how they work. I did see that in the note. But more importantly, you have to design them with the pedestrians and the bicyclist in mind from the get-go. This particular roundabout was not designed with pedestrians in mind. It would not be something you could retrofit easily because the speeds coming in and out of it are a little bit higher than you might want to have. You don't have the restrictions that you'd want to have and good places for the crosswalks. So they can be very used. And I will disagree with you, Celeste. Sometime we can go look and find. I'll show you a couple that I think are actually pretty good. Only a couple here in New York, but if you really want to see some good roundabouts, talk to our friends in Ohio. They actually have some really good roundabout stuff out there. Okay. Um, and the challenge, of course, is also an attitudinal one. There's a note in here about people not stopping for the pedestrians, but that's a crosswalk problem. We're going to be talking about crosswalks here in just a minute as well. And when we do, we'll remind you of something. It's a human factor that's hard for us to fix, but we should think about. Okay? Now, there are little things called mini roundabouts. You may see them in urban areas. This is one in Ithaca, New York. They actually have their place. They act a lot like a roundabout in terms of diverting traffic. They can actually be very effective rather than having to have a four-way stop sign or a two-way stop sign. The thing about with these is, again, think about pedestrians, think about bicyclists, think about emergency vehicles, think about snow plowing when you put them in. And again, they can be very advantageous. There's lots of good information in that booklet. I would read through it and they can be useful. Because I'm going to see how you guys do. What do you think roundabouts do? What is their crash modification value? Roundabouts reduce fatal injury crashes by how much? What do you think? Is it 20, 40, 60, 80%? Well, the public hates roundabouts, and I think you can actually click on more than one here. Some people say 60. Somebody says it does help with traffic congestion. They're very good for traffic congestion. 40. We have another 40. Let's go see what the results are on the thing here. This is the reason roundabouts are popular. The actual answer, 80%. 80% fatal and serious crash injuries. Because again, any crashes we do get are going to be side swipes. They're going to be relatively low speed compared to the speed around them. So they're really valuable in terms of that. If you've got places where you've got crashes that are occurring at relatively high speeds or intersections with lots of capacity problems, roundabouts is something to think about. But please do this for me. Don't just go, hey, let's start putting roundabouts everywhere. They have their place like everything in a toolbox. Okay? But think about that as putting something into it. Okay? Now, let's talk about low-cost countermeasures that stop controlled intersections. It's one of the proven countermeasures. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff out there on it. And we could spend a whole bunch of time doing that. You already know most of these. Okay? So let's just see what you come up with. What can improve safety at a stop controlled intersection? And I'll go ahead and actually let you put your responses in. Let's see what you come up with. Oh, you like that picture? Yeah, that sign's a little short. Yeah, that's why I took the picture of me around the stop sign. If I can put my hand over it, it's a little short. Advanced signage, yeah, absolutely. Make sure the stop signs are up there. Put a stop bar. Stop bars are really valuable. They're surprisingly more valuable than you think. You could put a flashing signal as an improvement in some cases. Enhance the visibility. Okay, make sure you have good advanced signage with the stop ahead symbol sign. We don't use the text sign anymore, we use the symbol. Okay, you can put lettering on the road. Make sure you've got good sight distance, reflectors. You can use enhanced striping that help realize you're coming up to an intersection. LED signs. I haven't seen the two of the ones I'm looking for yet. See if you guys did two more. Stop bar. I'll give you another 10 seconds to see if you could pick. There's two more I'm looking for. Good lines, improved lines, a blinking sign. Yep, blinking sign's one. You can put LEDs around the stop sign and have it go blink, 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 noting whether it's an all-way stop. The one I didn't see, you can double sign. Put signs on both sides of the roadway. They found that actually can be very effective because it alerts people no matter where they're looking. Okay, so that's something you want to keep in mind. Here's the thing, if you're putting a double stop up. If you're putting a double stop up, make sure those signs are set up so they look like they're the same size. I know of a couple of places where, because the road is skewed, or they tried to use a smaller sign on the left side, it really doesn't help the driver understand what the actual geometry is. So make sure you think about that. But there's a lot of cool stuff. The other thing, please don't do with stop signs. Don't just put stop signs up for speed control. It's actually technically a shall condition in the MUTCD. You shall not use stop signs for speed control. People try to do it all the time. And what happens? And this is an actual case. They put up a stop sign, and so they took the speed at Price, the road Prices, that's the fourth intersection, down from an average 85th percentile from 30 down to about 10. In other words, people kept going, they just kept rolling through it. And notice what happened to the average speeds in some of the other locations. They actually went up a little bit. It didn't really actually do what they thought it was going to do. And you got a lot more acceleration and deceleration. And we know that's actually one of the most dangerous times when you're getting in an intersection, is the time when you're decelerating and accelerating back and forth. The stop signs didn't stop people. Heck, it's faster than what we even think of as a good yield speed when you're at 10 miles an hour. Okay? Now, if we had A whole day, we could spend a whole bunch of time on all of the different countermeasures, but I want to focus on a few pedestrian and bicycle ones. Most of these we think of as urban areas, but surprisingly, a lot of these can be valuable in rural areas as well. Okay? So things like improved lighting and visibility for crosswalks. So let's go through a few of these. And again, we're going to focus on crosswalks and some enhancements to signals as we go through here. I'm a big fan of crosswalks. They can really help us see where, as pedestrians, where we should be, and they can help drivers say, hey, there may be people walking here. Now, in New York State, I do not need a marked crosswalk to have a crosswalk at an intersection. So this particular picture, it's near my neighborhood, has no crosswalks. There is actually technically a legal crosswalk there. If I wanted to, legally, I could gain the right of way by getting into that space with the sidewalk, walking across the road. The public doesn't know this. Okay? It may be the law, but they could put that on my tombstone. This is an attitudinal thing. We really need to get people to think about things, but this is not something we can solve easily. We need to think about the balance between pedestrians and bicyclists and cars and trucks and challenges like that. But stripes can actually help in a lot more ways than just what the legal right of way is. Put a couple of stripes down, helps the pedestrian know, please go here. And think about the driver. Right now, you drive down this road, trust me, there's a crosswalk marked to go to the school for the kids. Good, I like that. But it's hard to see this intersection. I turn up this road to go home all the time. I know where it is, but trust me, it's a little bit hard to see, especially at certain times of day if there's vehicles parked on the road. But think about if there was a stripe there. It can actually help in a lot of ways. Think about maybe shortening up the distance someone has to go, especially if there's parking with a bulb out. Okay? These are all valuable things we can think about. Enhancing the visibility of that crosswalk, making it more obvious that, hey, there are actually people wanting to cross rather than just walking down the sidewalk. You, of course, can put up signs. Signs can be very, very valuable, but make sure they can be seen. That sign that's over on the right that says yield to pedestrians, that's supposed to be in the street, not just sitting off to the side. I know a lot of agencies remove them for the winter for good reason. They don't like them to get hit by snowplows, but they should be placed in the center because, again, that's where they're going to get the most value. Okay? Do I need to add signage to an unmarked crosswalk at an intersection back here? Technically, no. Not in New York State. By rule, I don't need to. Is it a good idea to put signs up? Again, some intersections, it's probably worth it. There is a difference with mid-block crossings. A mid-block crossing, like you see here, has to have the markings and the signs for the pedestrians to be able to earn that right-of-way by being in the crosswalk. Okay? So in this case, a mid-block, it does have to be signs. Otherwise, vehicles have the right-of-way. Okay? Now, you can also put for your intersection something called a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. Okay, again, for both at intersections and at mid-block crossings. And here's how it works. There are some that are automated, but most of them are with a push button. So here you can see my wife's taking a picture of me hitting the button and then crossing across. And the vehicle coming down the road sees it flashing. And if they're set up right, when you see the flashing, you know, hey, there's probably somebody walking. They actually have one of these in Ithaca going down the hill and towards downtown, and a crosswalk that's hard to see. And at night, when people are wearing black, and people like to wear black, it can be hard to know there's a pedestrian there. But if they hit the button, it starts flashing, and I'm like, hey, there's somebody wanting to cross. I hate to say this, but the first thing I tend to do then is I check my rear view mirror to make sure the person behind me isn't going to create a crash. But I try to stop whenever I can. So that can be useful. The other thing you can go is the next level. It's called a pedestrian hybrid beacon. Now, these are actually pretty cool. And if we had a whole, 20, 30 minutes, we could talk about it. This is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's an intersection there. Doesn't need to have a traffic light. So they put the pedestrian hybrid beacon up. It's two red lights with a yellow light underneath. It's black most of the time. You hit a button, it starts to flash, yellow, then it turns to solid red, just like a stop sign. It actually is just like a traffic light. You're supposed to stop, and any pedestrians have the right of way to keep going. After a while, it'll actually start to flash red. When it flashes red, it acts like a flashing red stop sign. And if there's no more pedestrians, you can go on through. And then finally it goes back, after a quick brief yellow, goes back to nothing. They're actually relatively inexpensive. They can be a quarter the price of a standard signal, and they can be very effective in the right place. Okay? Um, and so let's look at some of the Q&A questions that you've got. Some people call them hawk lights. Yeah, that's an old term that's used. Um, Somebody mentioned there's one in Rochester. Again, they have their place. It says a lot of vehicles don't yield to pedestrians with an RRFB. Heck, a lot of them don't yield to pedestrians standing in the middle of the crosswalk. And then, of course, in that case, they can do what the law says in Connecticut. You're supposed to give a signal to the drivers that you want to cross. So I bet I know what signal they use. But yeah, these are something to think about adding to your toolkit. Somebody did ask, by the way, back earlier, I missed it, do I think they should be better for thermoplastics or epoxy for the crosswalks? It depends on your cycle time. If you've got a cycle time of only a year or two, you can even probably get away with waterborne paint. But if you're going to be going 2 or 3 years, you're probably going to have to use the higher grade materials, the epoxies and stuff like that. So look at your cycle time. But there's tons of things we could talk about. There's refuge islands, for instance. This is actually the Corning bypass that got replaced. The Denison Parkway is now safe to cross, even though it's 2 lanes. They put in these refuge islands. It's actually not too bad. You can actually cross it. In this case, a little harder maybe with 2 lanes, but refuge islands can be very, very effective. I wish there was more time. We could talk about a lot more opportunities, a lot more of these alternatives, improving countermeasures. But here's the thing I want you to keep and walk away with. Make sure you're looking at things that have been checked and proven. Okay? Has anybody, raise your hand if you've seen this on the internet, the alternative stripes. It'll slow people down because it looks like it's 3D. Raise your hand if you've seen this. And somebody put in there maybe a part 2 for approving countermeasures webinar. Possibly, possibly. It's a lot going to depend on the time and the demands and things like that, but we'll see. Maybe we'll ask our advisory panel about that today. So about 11 or so of you have seen this alternative stripe. It might look like it's effective in one direction, but let's go the other way. That just looks dorky. It doesn't really do what you think. It's just a stripe. It's nice to think about these alternative things, but we have to think about what's proven. What are the human factors? And some of it is we're going to have to do some changing of attitudes. Now, in New York State, a crosswalk requires striping. Pick all that apply. You get to pick multiple things. Yeah, it could cause folks to, that weird crosswalk can cause people to stop when there's not really a problem. Yeah. Somebody put D. Let's see what you guys have for results here. Okay. Some say it's always true. Some say it's always false. Some say it's only for mid-block crossings. Recommended to improve safety. None of the above. The answer is, in New York State, at an intersection, you do not need striping. But it is required for mid-block crossings if you want that to have the pedestrians being able to gain the right-of-way. But in any case, it can really improve safety. So look at your demands, look how many crossing people you've got, and think about, do you need a crosswalk? I don't think you need it at every single intersection, but it is something to think about because safety should be our #1 thing to think about. Now, in our last couple of minutes together, let's just see what you guys can put down for what are some proven countermeasures that you have, okay? And yes, as somebody put in the Q&A, context is so important. It's absolutely critical. Don't just blindly put things in. You've probably all seen where people threw speed humps in and they didn't look at the whole neighborhood. And so what they did was they moved the traffic from one road to another. And now the people on that road are complaining. Okay? So I'm going to give you a minute or two to put in your proven countermeasures, and then we will see what y'all came up with. Okay. Road stripes, pavement markings. Yep, that's good. Widening shoulders. We didn't talk about widening shoulders, but yes, that's a proven safety countermeasure. We know that can be challenging with right-of-way issues. Rumble strips. pedestrian island, bike lanes, mid-block raised intersections. Again, there's lots of them out there. If you're developing a local road safety plan and you're using proven countermeasures that are either in the Federal Highway Administration's list or the New York State Department of Transportation's Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, you're going to have a better chance of that plan getting you money when you try to apply for a grant. So try to use proven countermeasures. And some of them I'd like to see us start thinking about everywhere. I really like the safety edge. I think we should think about wider stripes. I think we should think about roundabouts in the right locations. Okay? Lighting can be very valuable. Beacons. Again, all of these things are there, but we haven't talked about it much. There is good information in the documentation about cost, but cost, of course, matters. I focused on some of the ones that are either relatively low cost, like some stripes and some breakaway hardware, or ones that have a really big benefit at the right application, i.e. the roundabout. Okay? But yeah, make sure your signs are done. I mean, a lot of these things we already know. We just need to create a plan, pick some good things we haven't tried before, and improve safety for everyone. I got about a minute. Does anybody have any questions or anything else they'd like to ask about? You can throw it into the Q&A. Okay. Wet weather markings, they make beads that are better for wet weather markings. Okay. Okay, so we'll move on here. Next week, we will be talking about improvements at curves, and we hope to see you at that particular webinar. Or you can come to one of our foundational webinars that are started up. And we're actually talking about traffic safety next week in more of a general holistic sense. That's on Tuesday. Okay, with that, thank you very much for joining us today. Everybody have yourself a great day. Stay safe, and let's try to improve safety for everyone so we all get home safely every single day. Take care. Bye-bye.